A wealthy heiress sits in perfect silence on a park bench, her dark glasses hiding eyes that have never seen sunlight, until a weathered man with calloused hands kneels before her and whispers the impossible. "I can heal your eyes." That moment ignites a firestorm of deception, stolen inheritance, and a father's chilling plot to keep his daughter blind forever. But he didn't count on the truth. This story will shatter everything you think you know about family and freedom. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Adrielle Kendrick turned her head toward the voice, though her eyes, clouded behind designer sunglasses, could only grasp the familiar darkness that had consumed her world for 3 years. Boston Common hummed with the ordinary sounds of a spring afternoon. Rustling leaves, distant joggers, the gentle splash of fountain water. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the smooth metal of the bench. She knew this park well. Not by sight, not anymore, but by routine, by the careful choreography her father had created. Barrett Kendrick stood 15 feet behind her, his charcoal suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the breeze. To passers-by, he looked like any devoted father watching over his disabled daughter. But his eyes held something colder, the calculating gaze of a man protecting an investment. The voice, rough and urgent, came from directly in front of her. "What did you say?" Adrielle asked, her heart suddenly racing. "I said I can heal your eyes," the man repeated, this time more clearly, with no hesitation, no pity, just absolute certainty. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You have no idea what's been tried. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, experimental treatments in Switzerland. My father spent millions." "Your father," the man interrupted, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, "is the reason you can't see." Adrielle's hands went rigid on the bench. The casual sounds of the park seemed to fade into white noise. "I've been watching you both," the man continued, his words careful and deliberate. "Every Tuesday, same time, same bench. He brings you here, walks away to make his calls, and you sit alone. But I've been listening to those calls, miss. And what I heard..." His voice trailed off. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Harlan. I work maintenance here. Fix the benches, tend the gardens. People don't notice guys like me. But I notice everything." She could hear him shift closer. "3 weeks ago, I heard your father on the phone with someone called Dr. Morrison. They weren't talking about healing you. They were talking about dosages." Adrielle's chest tightened. Something ancient and fragile inside her cracked. "Adrielle, sweetheart. Time to go." Barrett's voice rang out across the park, smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. Harlan's presence disappeared instantly, like smoke in the wind. She felt something small and warm pressed into her palm. A piece of paper, folded tight. "Tomorrow," came his whispered voice from somewhere behind her. "Same time, if you want to know the truth about your darkness." Barrett's expensive shoes clicked against the concrete as he approached. His hand settled on her shoulder, firm and possessive. "Having a nice time, darling?" he asked, his voice carrying that familiar note of controlled concern. Adrielle closed her fingers around the paper in her palm, feeling its sharp edges against her skin. For the first time in 3 years, she wondered, what if her blindness wasn't permanent? What if someone had been stealing more than just her sight? "Yes, father," she said quietly. Very peaceful. But her mind stayed with the maintenance man's words, with the promise he carried like a dangerous secret, and with the terrifying possibility that the man she trusted most had been her captor all along. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park in New Jersey, though Adrielle Kendrick couldn't see them. She sat perfectly still on the wrought iron bench, her pale dress arranged carefully around her knees, dark sunglasses reflecting the world she'd been told she'd never see again. The silence around her felt heavy, oppressive. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but the suffocating stillness of a cage. Barrett Kendrick stood 30 feet away, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low murmur that carried on the breeze. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a devoted father, keeping a careful eye on his disabled daughter. But there was something in his posture, rigid, controlling, predatory, that suggested otherwise. Harlan Morrison had noticed them 3 weeks ago. He'd been replacing the rotted slats on a nearby bench when the expensive black sedan pulled up, discharging the man in the expensive suit and the young woman who moved with the careful, measured steps of someone navigating a world without sight. What struck him wasn't their obvious wealth or her disability. It was the way her hands trembled whenever the man spoke, and how she seemed to shrink into herself when he drew near. Harlan had spent enough years on the streets, raising his daughter Maya alone, to recognize the signs of someone trapped. He'd seen it in battered women at shelters, in kids whose parents controlled every breath they took. But this was different. This was elegant, expensive entrapment. The kind that came with silk scarves instead of rope. Today, as Barrett paced near the fountain, his voice rising slightly with agitation, Harlan caught fragments of the conversation. Dosage needs to be increased. She's becoming too curious. Dr. Morrison assured me the effects would be permanent by now. Harlan's hands stilled on the bench he was repairing. He glanced at the young woman sitting alone, her face turned toward the sound of her father's voice with an expression of quiet desperation that made his chest tighten. When Barrett walked further toward the parking lot, still engaged in his call, Harlan made his decision. He approached slowly, his work boots silent on the grass. "Miss," he said softly, settling onto the bench beside her. "Don't turn around, and don't react too much. But I need you to listen to me." Adrielle's spine straightened, but she kept her face forward. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "No, ma'am. But I've been watching you and your father come here for weeks." Harlan's voice was steady, calm. "And I've been listening to his phone calls." "Excuse me?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to deference, but underneath it was something else. Uncertainty. 3 days ago, he talked about keeping you in the dark. Yesterday, he mentioned increasing your medication. Harlan paused, watching Barrett's distant figure. Today, he's discussing making the effects permanent. Adrielle's breath caught. "You're mistaken. My father is discussing my treatment with my doctors. I have a degenerative eye condition." "Do you?" Harlan asked quietly. "Or is that just what you've been told?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Adrielle's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white against the pale fabric of her dress. "You don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but her voice wavered. Harlan stood as Barrett began walking back toward them. Before leaving, he pressed something small and smooth into Adrielle's palm. A river stone, warm from his pocket. "If you want to know the truth," he said, his voice barely audible, "pay attention to what you put in your body, and ask yourself why your father is so interested in keeping you dependent." By the time Barrett reached the bench, Harlan was 20 feet away, back to repairing the park furniture as if nothing had happened. "Ready to go, darling?" Barrett asked, his hand settling possessively on Adrielle's shoulder. She nodded, slipping the stone into her purse. But as they walked back to the car, her mind churned with questions she'd never allowed herself to ask. The drive back to their Maryland estate was silent, Barrett's classical music filling the space between them. Adrielle sat in the passenger seat, her fingers worrying the smooth stone in her purse, the maintenance man's words echoing in her mind. Pay attention to what you put in your body. The Kendrick mansion sat on 50 acres of manicured grounds, a monument to Barrett's success and a prison disguised as paradise. Adrielle navigated its halls with practiced ease, counting steps, remembering the placement of furniture, following the familiar patterns that had governed her life for 3 years. In the sitting room, their housekeeper Mrs. Chun brought her afternoon tea Earl Grey with honey, the same blend she'd been drinking since the accident. Adrielle accepted the delicate china cup, but instead of drinking immediately as usual, she held it close to her face, breathing in the steam. There was something underneath the bergamot and honey, something bitter and medicinal that she'd never noticed before. Or perhaps she had noticed, but had dismissed it as an odd aftertaste, trusting that everything in her carefully controlled world was exactly as it should be. "Your tea's getting cold, sweetheart," Barrett said from across the room, his voice carrying that familiar note of gentle insistence. "Of course." Adrielle lifted the cup to her lips, but instead of drinking, she only pretended, letting the liquid touch her mouth before setting it aside. "I'm not very thirsty today." Barrett's newspaper rustled. "You need to stay hydrated. Doctor's orders." "Which doctor?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Dr. Morrison, of course. Your ophthalmologist." Barrett's voice remained steady, but there was something sharp underneath it. "The same doctor who's been overseeing your care since the accident." Adrielle nodded and picked up the teacup again, this time actually taking a small sip. The bitter taste was unmistakable now, coating her tongue with an unpleasant aftertaste that lingered long after she swallowed. That evening, after Barrett retired to his study for his nightly business calls, Adrielle sat in her room, the untouched remnants of her tea growing cold on the nightstand. For the first time in months, her head felt clearer, as if a fog she hadn't realized was there had begun to lift. And then, as she turned toward the window, something impossible happened. A flash of light, brief, barely perceptible, but unmistakably real, pierced the darkness behind her sunglasses. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to make her heart race and her hands shake. She pulled off her sunglasses and turned toward where she knew the window should be. Nothing but darkness. But for that one moment, she could have sworn she'd seen the outline of the oak tree outside her bedroom, its branches silhouetted against the evening sky. Adrielle pressed her palms against her eyes, wondering if she was losing her mind. But deep down, in a place she tried to silence for 3 years, a small voice whispered, "What if the maintenance man was right?" The next morning brought Maya Morrison to Riverside Park with a worn copy of Emily Dickinson's poetry clutched in her small hands. At 12, Maya had inherited her father's sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She'd been watching The Rich Girl and Her Scary Father for weeks now, ever since Harlan had started coming home with that look he got when something wasn't right in the world. Maya positioned herself on a bench near where the black sedan always parked, the book of poetry open in her lap. When Adrielle and Barrett arrived, she waited patiently, pretending to read while tracking their movements. Barrett followed his usual pattern, settling Adrielle on their regular bench before walking away to make his phone calls. But today Maya was ready. She approached Adrielle with the casual confidence of a child, plopping down beside her as if they were old friends. "I like your dress," Maya said conversationally. Adrielle turned toward her voice, surprised. "Thank you. Are you here with your parents?" "Just my dad. He works here." Maya glanced toward where Barrett stood near the fountain, his back turned to them. "He asked me to give you something." Before Adrielle could respond, Maya pressed the book into her hands. "Page 47, she whispered. "There's a bookmark." Adrielle's fingers found the slim object tucked between the pages. Not a bookmark, but something electronic and unfamiliar. "What is this?" Adriel asked, but Maya was already standing up. "Dad says to be careful who you trust, and to listen more than you talk." The girl's voice carried a gravity beyond her years. "He also says your father's been making calls about selling some property in Texas. Thought you might want to know." Maya disappeared as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving Adriel alone with the book and the mysterious device hidden within its pages. When Barrett returned a few minutes later, he found her reading Dickinson's words with her fingers, tracing the raised letters of the Braille edition with practiced ease. "I didn't know you enjoyed poetry," he said, settling beside her. "Mrs. Chen gave it to me. She thought I might like the tactile experience." The lie came easily, smoothly. Emily Dickinson wrote beautifully about darkness and light. Barrett's hand covered hers, stilling her fingers on the page. "You know I only want what's best for you, Adriel. The doctors say too much stimulation can be counterproductive to your healing." "Of course, Father." But even as she agreed, Adriel's mind was racing. Texas property. Phone calls. The bitter taste in her tea and the impossible flash of light she'd experienced the night before. Back in her room that evening, Adriel discovered that Maya had left her a phone. Sleek, small, and mercifully simple to operate. The device was already programmed with one number, and when she called it, Harlan's familiar voice answered immediately. "I was hoping you'd call," he said without preamble. "The girl, your daughter," she mentioned Texas. "Your father's been in negotiations to sell the Kendrick family ranch outside Austin. Apparently, it's been in your family for 4 generations. According to the conversations I've overheard, the sale would net him about $12 million. Adriel's breath caught. "That property belongs to me. It was part of my mother's inheritance." "Does your father have power of attorney over your affairs?" "Limited power of attorney. For medical decisions and day-to-day management while I recover." But even as she said it, Adriel realized how naive she sounded. How long had she been recovering? How many decisions had been made in her name? "Adriel," Harlan's voice was gentle but urgent. "I need you to start questioning everything. The medication, the doctor's visits, the legal documents you've been signing. Someone who truly had your best interests at heart wouldn't need to keep you in the dark about major financial decisions." After she hung up, Adriel sat in the darkness of her room, the phone hidden beneath her mattress, and tried to remember the last time she'd seen any legal documents. The last time she'd spoken to anyone besides Barrett, Mrs. Chen, and the mysterious Dr. Morrison who only visited when she was sedated for treatments. The fog in her mind was lifting, and with clarity came a terrible, creeping fear. 3 days later, Barrett's mood had shifted. He moved through the house with barely contained energy, making phone calls behind closed doors and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Adriel found herself drawn to his study, where the conversations seemed to center around timelines and preparations. She pressed her ear to the heavy oak door, straining to hear fragments of his words. "Clinic in California. Permanent care facility. Transfer needs to happen within the month." Her blood turned to ice. Permanent care facility. The words echoed in her mind as she crept away from the door, her hands shaking as she felt her way along the familiar walls. But Barrett had been listening too. "Adriel." His voice came from directly behind her, and she spun around, her heart hammering. "Father, I got turned around. I was looking for the bathroom." "The bathroom is down the hall, sweetheart. In the opposite direction." His hand settled on her arm, firm and controlling. "You seem confused today. More confused than usual." Adriel forced herself to sway slightly, to let her expression go slack. "I have a headache. I feel so foggy. Perhaps we should increase your medication." Dr. Morrison mentioned that stress can exacerbate your condition. Barrett's voice carried satisfaction, as if her confusion pleased him. Yes, Adrielle said, letting her voice sound weak and defeated. Whatever you think is best. But as Barrett led her back to her room, his hand possessive on her elbow, Adrielle's mind was clearer than it had been in years. She understood now that her confusion, her compliance, her helplessness, these were exactly what Barrett wanted, what he needed, and she finally understood that her father wasn't trying to heal her. He was trying to destroy her. That night, after Barrett brought her the usual cup of evening tea with its bitter undertaste, Adrielle made a decision that would change everything. Instead of drinking it, she poured it into the potted orchid by her window and lay down in bed, waiting for whatever clarity the morning might bring. As she drifted off to sleep, her hand found the hidden phone beneath her mattress, and she wondered how much time she had left before Barrett's plan, whatever it was, reached its final, irreversible stage. The answer, she suspected, was not much time at all. The address Harlan found in Barrett's discarded papers led him to a strip mall in Newark, wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. The nameplate on the door read, Dr. Marcus Morrison, Pharmaceutical Consulting. But the man who answered Harlan's knock looked nothing like the distinguished physician Barrett had described to his daughter. Marcus Morrison was thin and nervous, with the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors and the shifty eyes of someone with too much to hide. When Harlan mentioned Barrett Kendrick's name, those eyes went wide with fear. I don't know what you're talking about, Morrison stammered, but his hand trembled as he reached for the door. Harlan placed his palm against the wood, preventing it from closing. I know about the compound you've been synthesizing. The one that causes temporary vision loss and cognitive impairment. Morrison's face crumpled. You don't understand. I lost my license 3 years ago. Kendrick offered me more money than I'd made in a decade of legitimate practice. You needed to drug a young woman into believing she was blind. Harlan's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. How long have you been poisoning her? It's not poison, Morrison protested weakly. It's a neurological suppressant. The effects are meant to be temporary, but Kendrick kept increasing the dosage. At the levels he's been requesting. He trailed off, unable to meet Harlan's eyes. At the levels he's been requesting, what? The damage could become permanent, especially with prolonged exposure. Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. I told him we needed to reduce the concentration, but he said the timeline had changed. He wanted stronger effects, faster results. Harlan left the strip mall with Morrison's confession recorded on his phone and a sick feeling in his stomach. Barrett wasn't just controlling his daughter. He was systematically destroying her mind and vision to maintain that control. Meanwhile, across the state, Adrielle was conducting her own investigation. The morning after she'd skipped her evening tea, her head felt clearer than it had in months. Colors seemed more vivid behind her sunglasses, and twice she'd caught herself automatically stepping around obstacles she shouldn't have been able to see. She'd started using the burner phone's recording function to document Barrett's movements and conversations. Today, he'd spent 2 hours in his study with the door locked, and through the thin walls, she'd captured fragments of increasingly frantic phone calls. Needs to be moved by Friday. Barrett's voice was tight with stress. California facility is prepared for long-term care. Power of attorney transfer must happen before she has any more lucid moments. The recording device felt heavy in her palm as she replayed the conversations. Long-term care facility. Power of attorney transfer. The words painted a picture that made her blood run cold. But it was the attorney's name she heard mentioned, Richardson, from her mother's old firm in Washington, that gave her the first real hope she'd felt in years. It took 3 attempts to reach James Richardson, and when she finally got through, his voice was careful, professional. "Miss Kendrick, I was surprised to hear from you. Your father indicated you were receiving treatment for severe medical issues. Mr. Richardson, I need to ask you about my mother's estate, about the circumstances of her death." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Adrielle wondered if the connection had been lost. "Miss Kendrick," Richardson said finally, "I think we need to meet in person. There are things about your mother's final months that I believe you should know." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a cafe in Georgetown. Adrielle told Barrett she was visiting a specialist for a routine consultation, and he seemed pleased by her initiative to seek additional medical attention. Richardson was waiting for her at a corner table, a manila folder thick with documents spread before him. He stood when she approached, his expression grave. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," he said, helping her into her seat. "I remember more than people think I do." Adrielle kept her sunglasses on, but she could see Richardson clearly. The silver at his temples, the concern in his eyes, the way he glanced around the cafe as if afraid they were being watched. "Your mother came to see me 6 months before she died," Richardson began without preamble. "She was frightened, Miss Kendrick. She believed your father was trying to have her declared mentally incompetent." The words hit Adrielle like a physical blow. What? She'd discovered discrepancies in the family finances. Money being moved without her knowledge, properties being leveraged against debts she'd never approved. When she confronted your father, he began a campaign to convince everyone around her that she was becoming unstable. Richardson opened the folder and pulled out a stack of medical reports. He arranged for psychiatric evaluations, claimed she was having episodes of paranoia and delusion. Within 3 months, he'd assembled enough documentation to petition for guardianship over her affairs. "But she died before that happened." "Yes." Richardson's voice was quiet. "She died in what was ruled an accidental overdose of prescription medication. Medication that had been prescribed for anxiety and depression. Conditions she'd never exhibited until your father began his campaign against her." The cafe seemed to spin around Adrielle as the implications sank in. "You think he killed her? I think your mother discovered something that threatened his plans, and he eliminated that threat." Richardson leaned forward. "And I think he's been doing the same thing to you, only more slowly, more carefully. He learned from his mistakes." Adrielle's hands shook as she reached for her water glass. "What kind of mistakes?" "Your mother's death raised questions. Too sudden, too convenient. So with you, he created a different narrative. A tragic accident that left you disabled and dependent. No one questions a devoted father caring for his injured daughter." They talked for another hour, Richardson laying out a timeline that made Adrielle's stomach churn. The car accident that had supposedly caused her blindness. No police report could be found. The specialist who diagnosed her condition. No medical license on record. The treatments that kept her symptoms stable. No legitimate pharmaceutical source. "Your father has been systematically isolating you, Miss Kendrick. And according to the legal documents he filed last week, he's planning to have you declared permanently incompetent and transfer you to a long-term care facility." "When?" Adrielle's voice was barely a whisper. "The hearing is scheduled for Monday, 5 days from now." As Adrielle rode home in the taxi, her mind raced with plans and possibilities. She had 5 days to expose Barrett's deception, but first she had to survive until Monday. And judging by the frantic phone calls she'd been recording, Barrett was growing suspicious of her recent behavior. Her fears were confirmed that evening when Barrett entered her room carrying a cup of tea that smelled stronger than usual, more bitter, more medicinal. "You seem more alert lately, darling," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. Dr. Morrison thinks we should adjust your evening medication. Adrielle accepted the cup with steady hands, though her heart was pounding. I have been feeling a bit more aware. Is that bad? Not bad, just unexpected. We want to make sure you stay comfortable and calm. Barrett's voice carried that familiar note of false concern. Drink up. Adrielle lifted the cup to her lips, but as she tilted it, her body betrayed her. A shaft of lamplight caught her attention, and without thinking, she turned her head toward it. A motion too quick, too precise for someone who supposedly couldn't see. Barrett's eyes narrowed. Interesting. What? Adrielle tried to sound confused, but it was too late. You turned toward the light, Adrielle. Blind people don't do that. Barrett stood slowly, his expression shifting from false concern to something much more dangerous. How long have you been pretending? There was no point in maintaining the charade now. Adrielle set down the untouched tea and removed her sunglasses, meeting her father's gaze directly for the first time in 3 years. Long enough to know what you've been doing to me. Barrett's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally cold calculation. You clever little girl. But it doesn't matter now. The arrangements are already made. He moved toward the door, and Adrielle heard the distinctive click of a lock engaging. We'll be leaving for California tomorrow morning. I'm sorry you had to make this difficult. Alone in her locked suite, Adrielle used the burner phone to call Harlan. He knows, she said when he answered. Barrett knows I can see. He's locked me in, and he plans to move me tomorrow. We're not going to let that happen, Harlan said, his voice steady and sure. There's a charity gala tomorrow night in Connecticut. The Kendrick Foundation annual fundraiser. Your father will be there to maintain appearances. I can't get out of this room. Leave that to us. Maya and I have been planning for this possibility. Just be ready to move when we give you the signal. The next evening, as Barrett prepared to leave for the gala, Adrielle heard vehicles in the driveway. More than just Barrett's usual driver. Through her window, she could see a catering truck and several vans marked with the names of various service companies. At precisely 8 o'clock, as Barrett's sedan disappeared down the drive, the power went out. In the darkness, Adrielle heard her bedroom door click open. Harlan's voice called softly, "Time to go, Miss Kendrick." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Harlan's network of community connections had provided them with everything they needed: a catering uniform for Adrielle, a borrowed van, and most importantly, access to the Fairfield Country Club where the Kendrick Foundation was holding its annual gala. Adrielle sat in the passenger seat as they drove through the Connecticut countryside, her hands shaking with nerves and adrenaline. She was wearing a simple black dress borrowed from Maya's older cousin, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older, more professional. You don't have to do this, Harlan said as they pulled into the country club's circular drive. We have enough evidence to take to the authorities. No, Adrielle said firmly. He needs to see that I'm not the helpless victim he created. And all those people in there, they deserve to know who they've been supporting all these years. The ballroom was filled with Connecticut's social elite, all gathered to support the charitable work of the Kendrick Foundation. Adrielle moved through the crowd like a ghost returning from the dead, heading toward the stage where she could see Barrett preparing to address his guests. She slipped through the service entrance just as Barrett began his speech, positioning herself in the wings where she could hear every word. The Kendrick Foundation has always been about family, Barrett was saying, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. About protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Which is why tonight, I'm pleased to announce a significant expansion of our work. Adrielle stepped onto the stage, and the room fell silent. Barrett's words died in his throat as he stared at his daughter. Standing straight, moving with purpose, her eyes clear and focused as they met his across the stage. "Hello, Father," Adrielle said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone Barrett had abandoned. "I think it's time these good people heard the real story about the Kendrick Foundation's charitable work." The next few minutes were chaos. Barrett tried to maintain control, claiming Adrielle was having an episode, that she was confused and disoriented. But Adrielle had Richardson's documentation, Harlan's recordings, and most importantly, her own testimony about 3 years of systematic abuse disguised as medical care. When the police arrived, summoned by Richardson, who had been waiting in the audience, Barrett's composed facade finally cracked. The man who had controlled every aspect of his daughter's life for 3 years was led away in handcuffs, charged with medical endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. 6 months later, Adrielle stood in the same New Jersey park where Harlan had first spoken to her, but everything was different now. The bitter fog that had clouded her mind was gone, replaced by clarity sharper than she'd ever experienced. Her vision, freed from the pharmaceutical prison Barrett had created, showed her a world more vivid and beautiful than she'd remembered. The Kendrick estate had been sold, its proceeds used to establish a legitimate foundation for victims of domestic abuse and medical fraud. The Texas ranch, her mother's legacy, remained in Adrielle's hands, a symbol of the strength she'd inherited and nearly lost. Harlan approached across the grass, Maya at his side, both of them grinning as they watched the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community center that would bear Elena Kendrick's name. "Any regrets?" Harlan asked, settling beside her on the bench where this had all begun. Adrielle looked around at the gathering crowd, social workers, abuse counselors, legal advocates, and families who had found hope through the programs she now funded. She thought about the years she'd lost, the pain she'd endured, the mother she'd never properly grieved. "No regrets," she said finally. "Sometimes you have to lose your sight completely before you can truly see what matters." Maya tugged on her sleeve, impatient with adult philosophizing. "Are you coming to help us plant the flowers?" Adrielle stood, brushing off her jeans, simple clothes that she'd chosen for herself, that fit her real life instead of Barrett's carefully constructed fiction. "Absolutely." As they walked toward the garden where volunteers were already at work, Adrielle felt the weight of possibility settling around her like sunlight. She had money, freedom, and most importantly, the clear vision to use both wisely. The world Barrett had tried to steal from her was more beautiful than she'd ever imagined, and she intended to see every bit of it.